Mr. Speaker, today I rise on behalf of my coal communities and our coal miners who work every day to power this great nation. Currently, about 69% of our electricity in Kentucky comes from coal. Now more than ever, we must do everything we can to ensure that we have policies in place that promote a common sense approach to energy policy, and this includes coal. We hear a lot of talk out there about all of the above, and I truly am one that believes that it will take all of the above to meet our future energy needs. But right now, it almost seems that all of the above means all of the above except coal. And while the industry has typically had to worry about detrimental policies coming from the federal government, under Biden and Obama, we are now seeing unwanted government overreach from our own very energy and environment cabinet. Permitting delays have happened. They cause unnecessary red tape that reduces our competitiveness and out-of-control regulatory process that would impose $100 million in additional cost on the coal industry. And so that's something that we really need to do. This bill originally defined the waters of the Commonwealth under the same definition as waters of the U.S. And the reason we did that is that we've always had a bill that just says that our state regulations can't be more stringent than federal regulations. But I think there were a lot of people that raised some concerns because the Supreme Court actually narrowed the definitions of waters of the U.S. to the point that they were concerned that maybe some things might be left unprotected as far as our groundwaters are concerned. And I looked at that and kind of shared some of those concerns as well. And so I came today with a committee amendment that I felt like addressed a lot of the things that the people were really concerned about. And so that committee amendment then, after it passed, was rolled into House Committee Substitute. So, Mr. Speaker, would you ask the clerk to report House Committee Substitute 1 to Senate Bill 89?
Clerk, please report.
Senate Bill Substitute 1 to Senate Bill 89.
Gentleman from Webster.
Okay. Thank you. While the original Senate Bill 89 just made the definition of waters of the Commonwealth the same definition of waters of the U.S., which pretty much listed certain types of streams and that sort of thing, we were afraid that that might be kind of a broad definition. And so the amendment that we added, which is in this committee substitute, we listed besides the navigable waters as defined in Section 33 USC Section 1362, we included sinkholes with open throat drains. We included natural occurring artesian or phreatic springs, as well as any other spring used as a source of domestic water supply. And we also added wellhead protection areas to make sure that our wells are coming under that protection. Wellhead protection was also means and includes all wellhead protections areas as defined in Section 42 U.S.C. Section 300H-7E and is determined by the Cabinet pursuant to its obligations under 42 U.S.C. For regulation. So there were a lot of people that were involved in this process as far as approving the amendment. Not everyone believes that it goes far enough, but we did have a lot of folks that were, in fact, in agreement with these changes. Senate Bill 89 is supported by the Kentucky Home Builders Association, the Kentucky County Judge Executives Association, Kentucky Farm Bureau, Kentucky Coal Association, the American Petroleum Institute, Americans for Prosperity, Kentucky Association of Manufacturers, Associated General Contractors of Kentucky, the Associated Builders and Contractors of Indiana and Kentucky, and Agribusiness Association of Kentucky. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would move that we approve Senate Bill 89 as amended by House Committee Substitute 1.
Need to adopt the committee substitute first.
Oh,
gentlemen.
let's adopt the committee substitute, please.
Motion is for the adoption of House Committee Substitute 1. Is there any discussion of the committee substitute? Chair recognizes the lady from Jefferson 32 for discussion of the committee substitute.
May I ask the sponsor a question?
He will yield.
With this committee sub, I actually live adjacent to Beargrass Creek in Louisville, and it covers a good bit of Jefferson County. Would this committee sub provide any additional protections for Beargrass Creek, which I do not believe is navigable, but do any of the other changes here impact that?
Gentleman from Webster.
I do believe that the things that we listed included other types of waters, whether there be, there are a lot of water situations that maybe they're wetlands that don't have flow of water into them. You have wetlands that have water that do flow in and out of. You have inferior streams. You have water that's above ground sometimes, and then it's not. Then goes underground, then it comes back up or whatever. We believe that the cabinet does still have the ability to regulate these other sources of water.
May I speak briefly?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm glad to hear that because I've just been placed in the floodplain for that said creek, and so whatever's coming into the creek might be coming in my house.
Motion is for the adoption of House Committee Substitute 1. Those in favor signify by voting aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. House Committee Substitute 1 is adopted. Gentleman from Webster.
Mr. Speaker, I move for passage of Senate Bill 89 as amended by House Committee Substitute 1.
Question before the body is passage of Senate Bill 89 as amended by House Committee Substitute 1. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Fayette 79 for discussion of the matter.
May I speak on the bill?
Yes, sir.
You know, growing up, I played a lot of baseball. And one of my favorite things to do on a hot summer night when I came home from the game was to go into my shed and get my frog gig. And I'd take my frog gig down to the pond. And we had a couple of ponds on the farm, but the one that had the best frog gigging was the one that had the creek that run into the pond off and on. And that's where I'd find the most frogs. I'd gig at the night, and I'd bring back a mess of frogs for my dad and I, and we'd clean them, and we'd fry them up and have some good old frog legs. It was good eating. You know, you learn a lot about nature and respecting the environment when you're in it, like I had the opportunity to where I grew up. Ladies and gentlemen, this piece of legislation would drastically weaken the protection for Kentucky's water sources like the ones that I grew up frog gigging, and endanger the health, safety, and the economic stability of our communities across the Commonwealth. Genesis 2:15 said, "The Lord God took man and put him here in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." We are called to be good stewards of the earth, ensuring that we protect our environment. This legislation is a direct attack on our natural resources, and our people stand in direct contrast to God's command. Senate Bill 89 drastically changes the meaning of the definition of waters of the Commonwealth. This change will eliminate all protections for groundwater from pollutions that are currently in place right now. Clean and safe groundwater is extremely important to the people of the Commonwealth, providing drinking water for most of our fellow Kentuckians through our public systems. More than 416,000 Kentuckians depend on wells and springs. Furthermore, this bill would allow unrestricted dumping of hazardous substances, pollutants, and contaminants into streams, and it would eliminate requirements for permits, pollution limits, and even basic water quality monitoring. Another concern is our seasonal streams, which flow in response to rainwater and snowmelt. These streams are critical for slowing floodwaters and support aquatic ecosystems. Our drinking water systems, which rely on these seasonal streams and other small, inconsistent flowing bodies of water, will undoubtedly be impacted. This bill threatens the water quality of many of Kentucky's rivers and streams and tributaries, and as a result would significantly compromise Kentucky's groundwater, impacting water quality of more than 31,000 public use wells and at least 156 public water systems. By abdicating our responsibility as a state to oversee these waters in Kentucky, we put at risk our drinking water supplies for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of our people. Senate Bill 89 would make Kentucky the only state in the nation to surrender our own authority to define our own waterways to the federal government. The federal standard does not fully safeguard our vital water resources. The definition we put in place currently reflects Kentucky's unique water system, and the protections in the Clean Water Act have never and will not reach all of Kentucky's waterways. The majority of Kentucky's 90,000 miles of streams and rivers already are considered impaired for the purpose of swimming and fishing consumption because of pollution. This bill fails to consider how Kentucky's water chemistry is dependent on the entire watershed, including those seasonal streams, and that underground and interconnected waterways will lose protection. We are jeopardizing our ability to regulate one of the most important, precious natural resources we have. This is not just an environmental issue, my friends. This bill will also affect our economy and our people's health. This bill would require additional treatment for drinking and wastewater because fewer water sources would be protected upstream. The increased cost of additional testing would be passed down to Kentuckians through rate increases in our water bills. It will raise costs for our neighbors, our businesses, and our industries. If you're in the ecotourism business or you run an outdoor company, Senate Bill 89 will negatively impact your livelihood. Hunting, fishing, and other wildlife related to recreational activities produce nearly $6 billion a year in the Commonwealth. These industries would negatively be impacted, which today produce 70,000 jobs. The outdoor recreation industry is estimated to generate $12.8 billion a year in consumer spending, none of which would be possible without maintaining a healthy ecosystem and clean waterways. Aligning solely with the federal definition will create significant permitting delays, regulatory inconsistencies, and uncertainty for businesses in Kentucky. If we pass this bill, we are not only inviting economic instability, but a crisis into our communities, affecting the very health of the people we are supposed to be up here to serve. Why should our people have to pay more to avoid being poisoned by pollution? Water is a necessity for every human alike, and the people of Kentucky should not have to pay more to bypass regulations that have long safeguarded our health and resources for over 75 years. The citizens of the Commonwealth are not asking for this legislation. Folks, we've got to start doing what's right by our people and not what we think might help a certain industry or make a quick buck. I'm not sure who gets the attribution for this quote, but I found it moving. I did see that it was attributed at one time to Pope Francis, and that was found incorrect by Snoops on the internet, but I still think it's a great quote. Rivers do not drink their own water. Trees do not eat their own fruit. The sun does not shine on itself, and flowers do not spread fragrances for themselves. Living for others is a rule of nature. We are all born to help each other. No matter how difficult it is, life is good when you're happy, but much better when others are happy because of you. Folks, our people and our neighbors drink the river's waters. We eat the tree's fruit, and we smell those flowers' fragrances. It is our responsibility in this chamber to protect those beautiful natural resources that our Lord has placed in our care and stewardship. Proverbs 27:18 reminds us, whoever tends a fig tree will eat its fruit, and he who guards his master will be honored. Let us honor our duty to protect our resources and continue to sustain our families, communities, and environments. I implore you, please vote no on this bill to ensure Kentucky's water remains clean, safe, and accessible for our people now and for the many generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Webster.
Speaker, it's very difficult to kind of combat that type of hyperbole. But let me just say, I've been studying groundwater issues for a long time, back to the days we were talking about mountaintop removal and other things. The thing that we learned back then was that the biggest problem with our lakes and our streams and our rivers was sedimentation. And what is the number one cause of sedimentation? It's actually when it rains and the water gets higher and then goes down, and as it gets higher, it actually flows a little faster. And it's those banks of those creeks and streams and rivers that fall in that produce that sedimentation. That's the number one source. You know what the number two source is? It's pollution that runs off of the highways and our parking lots and that sort of thing. We don't quit building roads because we're worried about that, but that is a fact. That's the second number one reason that we have pollution in our streams, in our waterways. And the third thing is that hazardous substance dumping is still illegal. The Federal Reserve Conservation and Recovery Act, they have a Comprehensive Environmental Compensation Recovery and Liability Act, and Kentucky's many Superfund statutes all prohibit dumping of any hazardous substance and require cleanup of hazardous substance in all appropriate cases, including specific cases of groundwater contamination. These laws are not affected by this bill. Groundwater is still going to be protected. We have numerous provisions of state and federal law, including KRS Chapter 151 and the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act's Underground Injection Control Program. And these bills this bill does not interfere with any or none of these provisions. So with that, I mean, you can say anything you want to. There are people who we could not write an amendment that would please all of them, but I can tell you that I don't think there's any one of you here on this floor that's going to vote for this bill that believes a thing that you just heard, and I certainly wouldn't, and I would hope that no one would if they had validity. They do not. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the lady from Floyd for discussion of the matter.
Will the sponsor yield to a question
He will yield.
or a series of questions?
A series of questions?
One
at a time, Mr. Speaker.
So does this bill do anything to amend or retract the groundwater protections provided by KRS Chapters 151, 223, 349, 350, and 353?
Gentleman from Webster.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not equipped to have a member list a group of statutes or whatever and say, without having those in front of me, whether or not it impacts those. I'm sorry.
Lady from Floyd.
Fair enough. I was told that this does not further impact protections by Kentucky statute, which protects our groundwater. So I was just trying to confirm that. But,
Okay.
but ultimately, you're not sure whether or not this will impact those statutes?
Well, other than the folks have told me, as I mentioned earlier, that this does not, that groundwater would still be protected by the statutes and acts that are already in place, and I would assume that that includes the ones that you mentioned.
Lady from Floyd.
Will you yield to another question?
He will yield.
So you mentioned that SB89 will not remove protections which prohibit the dumping of hazardous materials into our waterways, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Gentleman from Webster. Lady from Floyd. Sorry.
Does this statute, will this change in any way prohibit our counties or our cities from compiling ordinances or enforcing ordinances to prevent the dumping of trash or other substances into our waterways?
Gentleman from Webster.
I think this bill actually does talk about the definition of waters of the Commonwealth as it relates to waters of the U.S., and it does work in a way to ensure that our state cabinet is not being more stringent than federal regulations, but I think that our local counties and governments can actually impose regulations that are more strict than. I don't think there's anything in this bill that takes away the ability of our local county governments or city governments or water districts actually that are actually in fact providing water to their customers, our residents.
Lady from Floyd.
Will the sponsor yield to another question?
He will yield.
So does this bill take authority away from the cabinet to enforce any violations that would occur through this legislation or any of the other statutes that you mentioned which protect our groundwater?
Let me say, lady, I do not believe so.
Lady from Floyd.
So you believe that if the violation has occurred, that the cabinet would still have the authority to go in and enforce those regulations?
I would certainly hope so, and I think yes.
Lady from Floyd.
So I noticed that the Kentucky Rural Water Association remains neutral on 89, but it encouraged the refinement of some language to protect our water in the full term, or in the long term. Can you explain to me what this bill requires coal companies to do as with regard to long-term water treatment?
Gentleman from Webster.
My understanding is that there are lots of regulations involved in the mining process, that sometimes mitigation ponds are set up so that water doesn't run off, so we don't have pollution off-site of that particular coal mine. I think where we're seeing an issue here, and the reason for this bill is that a lot of the permits that mining companies have to have, and others as well, it's not just mining, maybe road building, it may be lots of others that they have to get from the state, 402 or maybe 404 water permits, and evidently because of their new regulations, they're expecting that the cost for those permits could be as much as $100 million more, and that's what I have been told. And so it's not that they can't get the permits, just going to cost a lot more. And you know, a lot of times they have to, when you have permits like this, they have to do bonding, and bonding is for some things is not an easy process to get. There are not a lot of companies out there that write these types of bonds, and so what that means is, in many cases, if you can't buy a bond from an insurance company, what you have to do is put up cash, and so that does tie up, or pretty much hurt the companies that have to have those permits, because they're having to tie up so much of their money in the bonding process.
Lady from Floyd.
But this bill does require the
Lady from,
bonding.
would you like to ask another question?
Yes. Will he yield to another question, please?
He will yield another question.
But this bill does require the bonding.
Oh yeah,
Gentleman
I'm sorry,
from
Mr.
Webster.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill does not say that they don't have to go back and get those permits. It just we're trying to make sure that there's not a huge increase in the money that's required to get the permit and the bond that is required to get the permit. But nothing in the law changes the fact that they have to have the permits.
Lady from Floyd.
Okay, thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Jefferson 42 for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield to a question?
He will yield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gentlemen, I want to specifically talk about our hazardous substance law, and I won't go too deep into it, of course, for the sake of not to go through particular statutes, but this is KRS 224, which talks about the ability for the Energy and Environment Cabinet to require cleanup of releases into the environment. In here, environment is defined to include waters of the Commonwealth. And I want you to help my understanding here. Am I correct that if environment in this statute no longer includes groundwater or headwater streams under the law, would then contamination of those waters no longer trigger the enforcement that's codified under this statute?
Gentleman from Webster.
I think you're reading something into it that may not be there. There is a fact that we are changing the definitions of waters of the Commonwealth to comply with the federal definition of waters of the U.S. But as I said earlier, the other laws that we have in place doesn't automatically say that because we're not listing every possible thing out there, that we're somehow meaning that those don't have to be regulated or protected or whatever. As you mentioned, KRS 224.1-400, I think relates to Kentucky's mitigation of the Superfund statute, and it does prohibit all dumping of hazardous substances, and it does require cleanup of hazardous substances in appropriate cases, including specifically caused by groundwater contamination. Those laws are not affected by this bill.
Gentleman from Jefferson.
Will the gentleman yield to just another question?
He will yield.
Thank you for that, gentleman. That helped my understanding on the remediation side. I want to stay on that really quickly. We heard testimony earlier today in relation to carcinogens, or for those who are listening to that those are cancer-causing contaminants. And my question is, if by chance there is contamination by substances that are carcinogens or carcinogenic, if that occurs in waters no longer covered by the protections, are there in this bill any emergency response procedures included that would address the contamination?
I think again, Mr. Speaker, I think again that the assertion that just because the definition of waters of the Commonwealth doesn't list all these specific things that are clearly illegal, are still illegal, that somehow there's no protections under the new law. That's totally two different things. In other words, the definition, the cabinet have told me that they issue these types of permits that we're talking about based on the definition of waters of the U.S. So they're already issuing permits based on the definition of waters of the U.S. So if they list the same classifications as waters of the Commonwealth, that's what they're going to issue their permits for. But I don't think the cabinet is ever going to give you one permit and say, okay, this is permit, you got to do something here, but you're allowed to permit, or you're allowed to pollute somewhere else. I mean, that's just not something that they do.
Gentleman from Jefferson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Jefferson 48 for discussion of the matter.
Speak on the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this bill. I've gotten quite a few emails about this particular bill, and I just want to give you a little perspective of where I'm coming from. And that is, when I ran an aerial survey and mapping company for over a decade and a half, I had to work, and I had to, but I enjoyed working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Geological Surveys, the U.S. Corps of Engineers, and several other federal agencies. And there is strict guidelines in terms of when you go through and map these areas throughout the country. You have to adhere to those. And there's really strong federal guidelines in order to what you can or cannot do in terms of altering the course of a particular river. In fact, in the USGS, they have blue lines. It could be a dotted line or a solid line. A solid blue line on the USGS map, it's a stream. It could be very, very, very small, maybe a couple inches wide. But there's also a dotted line, dotted blue lines, and that's basically it's dry and it's wet, depends on the rainfall and so forth. You have to be really conscious of what you need to do and how you need to address that from the federal guidelines. So when I've mapped, like I said, I've mapped all of Kentucky, and in fact I've mapped basically throughout the United States, and even helped a friend of mine. We mapped the ocean in Alaska and Australia and other parts of this world. And I'm very understanding and sensitive, and I appreciate the gentleman from Webster when he worked with the groundwater, because that is a important thing we need to be conscious of. So, and I do appreciate him working with the Louisville Water Company in order to make some adjustments and modifications to that. So when it comes to overreach, I have heard on several occasions when somebody digs take a backhoe and dig a ditch, well, they got to get a permit. That's basically, they're trying to alleviate some situation, and they'll fill it back up, but yet they had to get a permit. That doesn't seem to make sense in terms of what the government is doing, and that's, to me, is a little bit of an overreach. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to support this bill, and I appreciate the gentleman from Westford and working through this and trying to find solutions to this. I don't have any serious concerns anymore in regards to this particular bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the lady from Jefferson 34 for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield to a question, please?
He will yield.
Thank you. Sponsor, you stated this earlier at the beginning of your comments, and I didn't quite catch all, but if you would be so kind enough to repeat, what were the groups that you mentioned that were in support of this bill that you had heard from?
Gentleman from Webster.
Yes. The list that I have been given were the Home Builders Association of Kentucky, the Kentucky County Judge Executive Association, Kentucky Farm Bureau, Kentucky Coal Association, the American Petroleum Institute, Americans for Prosperity, the Kentucky Association of Manufacturers, Associated General Contractors of Kentucky, Associated Builders and Contractors of Indiana and Kentucky, and the Agribusiness Association of Kentucky. Those are the ones that I was given that are in support of this bill.
Lady from Jefferson.
Will the sponsor yield to a question, please?
He will yield.
Thank you for your response, sponsor. My question would be, what environmental groups are in support of this bill?
Gentleman from Webster.
There are several environmental groups that have reached out to me concerning this bill. A lot of them have presented us language that we considered. I kind of arranged for people to get together and pretty much just said that if you don't get together, this bill is probably not going to go anywhere. But I did not sit in on those meetings specifically. I did meet with the environmental, the Environment Cabinet. I met with the Natural Resources folks. National Resource Council. There were some other folks that did contact us, including some of the water groups out there. But I think they all had input, but I would not say that those groups are necessarily supportive of this bill.
Lady from Jefferson.
May I ask, will the sponsor yield to another question, please?
He will yield.
Sponsor, are you prepared in the following session, or in the event that we need to come back into session in an emergency situation, to undo any unforeseen consequences that might seem apparent to environmental groups and other people in this room, such as myself today, if things do not go the way that you think they may go?
Absolutely. With proper knowledge and facts showing that there were detrimental impacts because of this, yes, ma'am, you have my word.
Lady from Jefferson.
Will the sponsor yield to one final question, please?
He will yield.
Thank you. Sponsor, is this legislation in response to a coal mine accident and the waste that was produced?
Gentleman from Webster.
Oh, I'm not aware of any coal mine. This is not something I'm aware of. I don't think so.
Lady from Jefferson.
May I speak on the bill, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I'm really at a loss for words, and I will be brief. This is a very dangerous bill. I hear the intention that and I hear what you're saying in your ability to try to persuade and put people's minds at ease regarding this, saying that things have been corrected, things have been fixed, that there will not be the consequences that so many are concerned about. The fact that no environmental groups were brought to the table in crafting this legislation is so irresponsible. And that should be a huge red flag to every single person in this room that this is problematic and that the outcomes will not be good for Kentuckians. It won't be good for our farmers. It won't be good for the kids that play in the water, the creeks. It won't be good for the cattle. It won't be good for the fish. It won't be good for people who are still dependent on well water. We're going to have a real Aaron Brockovich on our hands here, and I'm not interested in being a movie based on a situation like that where communities begin to become so sick. I heard from an attorney in my district who is formerly with the Natural Resource and Environmental Protections Cabinet, sounding the alarm about this as soon as it was heard over in the Senate. We will be undoing decades of protection that we have given to our water here in this state. I will not be in favor of this bill. I will not support it, and I would encourage people to really think about this before you support this. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Campbell 67 for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the gentleman from Webster a question?
He will yield.
Thank you. Yeah, and obviously it sounds like a big part of this bill is redefining or what we call water or waters of the Commonwealth. There are some words in the new definition I simply don't understand, and I would ask if you could explain that to me or point where these may be defined in statute. Specifically, there's a phrase, naturally occurring artesian or phreatic springs, and I just do not know what that is. Thank you.
Gentleman from Webster.
I'm not exactly sure, but what I think we're talking about naturally occurring artisan or peripheral springs. There are springs that sometimes they have water above ground, and sometimes it goes underground, and sometimes it comes back up. And I'm thinking that that's the type of water sources that they may be referring to. But there again, I'm not an environmental attorney. I'm not a geologist. We do have a geologist here, and that might be a better question directed at him. But I just don't know for sure. I just tried to include the things that people told me that probably should be listed to make sure that they were at least listed as being protected.
Gentleman from Campbell.
Okay, yeah, like I said, I mean, these are not what I would understand as common words, and I think it would be helpful to define these, or at least point to where they're defined in some other statute. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Laurel 90 for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speak on the bill?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation, specifically the part on the treatment of long-term bonds. This did come through regulations back in August from the Energy and Environmental Cabinet. It was deferred 3 times, and until we got them in Monday and asked them specifically on if they were going to treat the long-term treatments of bonding requirements different. And so we asked the Cabinet, would the Cabinet's proposal result in over $100 million in additional cost on the coal industry? And they said yes, that's correct. When I asked if any other state has a similar definition of long-term treatment or similar bond calculation, they said no one else has a specific definition or calculation like Kentucky. And also, when I asked if they thought the Cabinet's proposal would cause several coal mines to go out of business, they said that's a possibility. You can go back and watch. And I think there was a question on the bonding earlier on what this bill does on that. All it does is it codifies what we currently do. But if you support coal, you should be for this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Knox for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to speak on the bill.
Yes, sir.
To clear up the lady from Floyd, I want to read to you real quick that you cited the KRS, and you were correct that it doesn't affect them having the ability to inspect and still do the monitoring. And that includes KRS 151, 223, 349, 350, and 353. Not only that, but it also does not deal with the Federal Safe Water Act. This came from the Supreme Court several years ago that finally had a clear vision on something that affected us dramatically, and that was our water take-in. And what they purposely said and clarified and cleared it up, and the reason for the bill today is that water starts from a stream, it goes to a river or creek, and then goes to either a shed or to the ocean. That's considered a water. That is all that we're doing. We're bringing it down. And even the past administration changed their federal regulations to fall in line with the federal Supreme Court. All we're doing is falling in line with what they had changed in our Clean Water Act. And all this bill does is it falls in line with what the federal guidelines is. We don't supersede it, as the gentleman said. So I'm not going to stand here and give a coal speech, as I typically do, but I will say it's not only coal that we're talking about farmers. We're talking about water that stands in their field that an EPA can come by or a water inspector can come by from the cabinet and deem it as a wetland. We can have a contractor who fixes a piece of property and the weather delays them and we have standing water and they come by and be fined. We wouldn't have to do this even if the cabinet wasn't so overbearing and over strict on what they do with the regulations that are in place. So the only thing we're doing, and the only thing the sponsor from Bell, the senator, is doing here is bringing us in line with the federal guidelines. We're not superseding them. This isn't a sky falling moment. We're not destroying our waterways, and we're not destroying our access to water. So in saying that, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say that this is not just a one entity bill for coal. It goes across the board, as this gentleman indicated, all the people that supported it. Just read that list. That's your people. That's the ones that generate our income here in the state of Kentucky, and they're asking for this to be dealt with so they can operate and they can run business and on a daily basis without the restrictions and overburden on what the cabinet has done to them with the inspectors. But I appreciate the comments, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Fayette 45 for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the gentleman from Webster a question.
He will yield.
Thank you. Gentleman from Webster, as you know, you're on the committee with me that this went through this morning. We on the committee received correspondence from the Energy and Environment Cabinet, and I just want to make sure that I hear you right. So the Cabinet was saying that essentially this committee substitute leaves 89,000 domestic and agricultural use wells, 156 water systems, which 1.5 million Kentuckians essentially rely on or use unprotected. Are you saying that the Cabinet is wrong and that's inaccurate information?
Gentleman from Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm saying I don't agree with the cabinet on that.
Gentleman from Fayette.
Also stating that there are lakes and reservoirs that aren't just used for drinking water, but also used for water recreation, whether that's for Kentuckians or people coming into the state for tourism and recreation. You agree with the Cabinet's assessment that those waters are left unprotected by this committee substitute?
Gentleman from Webster.
Were we at the same meeting? I didn't hear the cabinet testify to anything at the meeting today.
Gentleman from Fayette.
Yes, the gentleman from Webster is correct that the cabinet did not testify to anything. We were running short today. We've running this through pretty quickly. It wasn't much time for testimony or even questions, but we'll drive forward. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, permission to speak on the bill?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear a lot of talk, and it sounds to me like there are some people who view this as a coal bill, and I read it and I view it as a water bill, and we're here, we bring different perspectives to the chamber. That's why we come from 120 different counties. One thing I haven't heard much about is our livestock. I haven't heard too much about our agriculture. I know we've talked about carcinogens that can cause cancer and things that go into drinking water, and whether that is protected by other statutes, whether federal or at the state level. You know, I think about growing up on farmland. My granddad raised tobacco. I think about my uncle who raised cattle. I think about going out and fishing on Elkhorn Creek. I think about things like that may not even apply directly to our drinking water, but still may be impacted by this. I know the gentleman from Fayette behind me already quoted some scripture earlier. When the gentleman from Bell and the other chamber proposed this on the Senate floor, He's quoted in the media as saying, God gave us coal, or put coal under our feet so we can use it. And I don't disagree with that. I'd also say that God gave us a planet with water as well, too. And he already quoted Genesis. I'll quote Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. So the Spirit of God hovered above the waters. It was the very first thing there in creation. It was pure. My Lord and Savior was pierced. Blood and water flowed, water representing purity and life everlasting. Mr. Speaker, gentlemen of this body, I have nothing against coal, and I do believe that all of the above doesn't have to mean all of the above except coal. But I think that water is more necessary for human life, our agriculture, and things that we need here. I don't want to put it at risk. Having in-laws who live just down I-75 from Flint, Michigan, I would hate to see the next Flint be here in the Commonwealth. I urge the other members of this chamber to vote no with me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Jefferson 46 for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I speak on the bill, please?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Speaker, the geologist has stood. I'm not sure what I'm going to speak on today. I wasn't prepared for this, but I don't know whether I need to talk about geology and hydrogeology, contaminant migrations and solubilities and mobilities and things that would put you guys to sleep, I know. Or whether I should talk about how sediment gets in lakes. It's usually runoff, by the way, from erosion, from development, clear cutting, strip mining, anything that tears down vegetation, building, you get runoff. And yes, when the water goes down and comes up, you get more sediment. That's because the sediment's running in that's running off from where it's eroding. I know it's not a hard concept to understand, but I spent several years in private consulting, environmental consulting, as a hydrogeologist, and been on numerous sites of assessment, investigation, remedial action, studying the subsurface, defining extents of releases, contaminant, various types of contaminants all over the state, all over the country. And I worked for private industry. I was a consultant for private industry to help provide advice as they go through the regulatory process, to keep them from getting fined or minimizing fines or whatever the case might be. I've seen a lot. I understand a lot. I don't want to sit up here and talk for 2 hours, but I could. The thing that really worries me around here, I've been here 9 years, and it's really frustrating for a scientist to work as a legislator, because I feel a lot of times we pass stuff without giving things a lot of thought. It's kind of a society problem too. In this social media driven world, we tend to have to move so quickly that we don't use the brains that the man upstairs gave us. And it's frustrating for somebody that's a data-driven person. It's frustrating that I didn't know what happened today in this committee until I came here. I knew this bill was out there. I knew the Senate had passed a bill that, frankly, I thought was dangerous. I thought was ludicrous. And I thought they don't know what they're doing. The intent may be there to do something, but they don't realize the can of worms that they're opening up just by changing a definition. But I had heard that The sponsor was working on some changes. And I heard of my text last night. My phone was blowing up with all kinds of different texts. I woke up this morning and I seen all the changes and all the bills that were coming in last night. And it's been like this for 2 days now. And then we run them through committee the next day, so you can't file an amendment if you needed to file an amendment. It kind of feel a little worthless without getting a suspension of the rules, which I'm in the minority party. I would never get that. So I'm just going to say this. I'm not going to get into any detail because half the people that are listening aren't going to understand what I say. They're not hydrogeologists. This is a scary bill. I won't be supporting it today. You can take that for what you want. I suggest you don't support it either. Even though the changes that were made last night were good, they were better, they made the bill better. Like I said, it was a very dangerous bill when it went through the other branch. We shouldn't be too surprised with that, some of the stuff they send over here sometimes. Just kidding. But it's still not good enough for me. So I'll be voting no today, and I hope you will join me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the lady from Fayette 76 for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I speak to the bill, please? Thank you. First of all, I really don't like going after the gentleman from Jefferson after that. But I have heard arguably more on this piece of legislation from my constituents than I have about anything else that we have talked about all session, maybe even combined. Without fail, every single one of them is terrified by what this bill means. I have a lot of concerns. I agree with my colleague from Jefferson that the changes that were made last night do make the bill slightly better. I actually am familiar with the natural springs. I have a large one on my farm. So what that would mean is that when you have the water coming up out of the ground and it becomes a naturally occurring spring, it would be protected. But what is not protected is what is underneath the rock before it comes up. So it's a question of whether it has hit daylight or not, whether it is protected or not. Ultimately, that water goes to the same place. It still feeds our wildlife. It still goes into our water systems for us to digest, for us to drink. And so it doesn't really change the intent, ultimately, I don't believe. I have a lot of concerns about what happens with our drinking water. I have spoken with our water producers in Fayette County. They have assured me that they would be testing and treating the water to the point to make sure that it was safe for their customers, but that is going to come at a higher cost. Well, we all know the economics of that. That means that it's going to cost more to make the water safe. Ultimately, and they did not say this, but ultimately that cost is going to get passed on to our consumers. I'm very concerned about what that means for people who are already struggling with the price of eggs, to then have to worry about paying more money for their water bills to make sure that they have clean water to drink. I've heard from people across all kinds of different industries. I've heard from farmers. The Farm Bureau is officially in favor. I've heard from a lot of farmers who are not in favor of this. And what does that mean for their livestock and their irrigation needs? I have heard from avid outdoorsmen, hunters and fishers, and what does it mean for the fish that they catch that they're going to ultimately feed to their families? I have a lot of concerns about this. On the coal side, my godfather was heavily involved with the coal business. He was one of the smartest men I've ever known. And he told me from a very young age that coal is a finite resource, and it is wonderful while we are here, and we do need to use it while we are here. But that we've got to be protecting the things that are also going to serve us after coal is gone. And I believe that allowing extra pollution to our waterways is a major disservice, not only to our current population, but for generations to come. I also spoke with a constituent last night who was very upset that she was unable to get here to testify this morning about Senate Bill 89 because it hadn't been shared early enough. And she happens to be a dentist. She grew up in McLean County on the Green River, which she told me when she was a child that was actually a green river. It is not now. She grew up across the street from one of the power companies there, which of course is meeting all of the pollution standards required. She has 5 family members across 4 different generations who have been diagnosed with rare forms of cancer, all different kinds, because of their proximity to the power plant there. What that tells me is just because the environmental regulations are being followed doesn't mean that it is safe. So for us to be considering any reduction to our environmental protections really scares me, and I think we need to do better both for the people who are here now, relying on our water, but also for our future and for all of the kids that are coming up behind us. So I am also a no on this bill and encourage everyone else to be. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from LaRue for discussion of the matter.
Permission to speak on the...
Yes, sir.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I feel like I've gone back to kindergarten today. We've heard Chicken Little over and over and over. There's not a single one of us in here that does not want good drinking water. We've talked about coal. People have brought up about agriculture. I'm going to tell you, as a full-time farmer standing here in the room, the biggest concern I have right now is not about the markets, it's not about weather, it's about government overreach shutting our operation down so that my boys cannot continue it. Folks, we're not going backwards on this. We still have regulation in place that we're going to follow. You know, it's sad when, like my counterpart over here spoke about earlier, that somebody from EPA can drive by, see standing water in a field that came from a rain event that I cannot control, and all of a sudden want to put me under the sharp microscope. Folks, our water is much cleaner today than it's ever been. We're not going back to those standards. You know, I get mad when I hear people talk about environmentalists and environmental groups, because a lot of times they have an agenda. And I get real mad when they attack agriculture, they attack farmers, because there's not a bigger group of environmentalists out here, and there's not a bigger environmentalist standing in the room right here today than what I am. Because I want to take care of the soil, I want to take care of our resources, because that's how I make my living. I applaud the gentleman from Webster for standing up and presenting this today on behalf of the senator. Folks, government overreach is what's going to shut down this country. And this right here is just a prime example of us trying to clean up some of this language. We are not going backwards. And I'd encourage everyone, on behalf of all the farmers out here, to stand up and vote in favor of this bill. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the lady from Fayette 93 for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I speak on the bill?
Yes, ma'am.
Wow, we've heard a lot today, and I have a lot to say, and I've been trying to come up with what points I want to make as I'm listening to my colleagues across the aisle and the colleagues on the same side of the aisle as I am. But and I don't want to repeat anything, and I don't want somebody to try and, mansplain to me what things mean. But I'm going to say this. We are watching chaos evolve and erupt in D.C. With the current administration. What are we going to do? With this bill, we are giving up. We are giving away. We are ceding the authority that we have over our own water systems. What are we going to do when the federal government makes a decision that we don't like, but we've already given away all of our power? I personally do not want somebody in Washington, D.C. making these decisions for me. There's nobody there that knows Kentucky, knows our waterways, knows our environment the way that we do. I have swam, and I can't tell you how many creeks in Round County except Triplet. I've never swam in Triplet Creek. But there's no reason for us to do this. We have the ability here, if we want to match federal law, great, just say it, but don't give away our authority to make decisions for ourselves. There's nobody in D.C. who's going to take care of the farmers like we want to take care of the farmers here. We all want the same thing. We want a good environment. We want our businesses to survive. We want our farms to survive. We want to feed our kids. We want our animals to be healthy. We want to be healthy. We don't want to take in toxic pollutants. So let's do that here. Let's take care of that here in this body rather than giving away our authority to somebody else. I strongly encourage everybody to vote against this bill. There is absolutely no reason for it, and we can do what this bill wants to do, but we can do it on our own and maintain our own control. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question for the body's passage of Senate Bill 89 as amended by House Committee Substitute 1. Clerk will sound the chimes. Those in favor vote aye. Those opposed, nay. Roll call is open for your vote. Chair recognizes the lady from Jefferson 38 for explanation of vote not to exceed 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to explain my no vote today. I voted no today on Senate Bill 89 because our water is our most vital resource. I don't believe in lowering standards or lessening regulations on our water. We cannot rely solely on the federal government, their guidelines, to protect our Kentucky water, period. Clean and safe water is essential for every Kentuckian, and we must protect it. Our body must protect it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the lady from Scott 88 for explanation of vote not to exceed 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Housing affordability is a growing concern all across Kentucky and certainly in my district in central Kentucky. And Senate Bill 89 addresses regulatory uncertainty. When we have regulatory uncertainty, it plays a role in the rising cost of new housing developments, as well as increasing costs for land development and infrastructure, and prolongs project timelines due to additional compliance burdens. This bill safeguards our natural resources while promoting responsible growth. And this framework provides predictability for developers who are building affordable housing in central Kentucky and ensuring that those essential environmental protections remain in place. I was very proud to vote yes today on Senate Bill 89. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Jefferson 30 for explanation of vote not to exceed 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill makes about as much sense to me as if we were to restore the smoking section on an airplane. The thought that air and water don't mix is just confounding to me, and unfortunately, I think we're going to be back debating this very issue in 5 or 10 years, and we're going to regret today's vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Jefferson 46 for explanation of vote not to exceed 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I voted no mainly because I didn't want to be the first state to relinquish our state's rights on Clean Water Act. Also voted no because I have a great deal of respect with our karst topography in central Kentucky, which is one of the most extensive karst topography areas in the world. It's what Mammoth Cave is involved with, and And when we try to protect these areas by calling it sinkholes with open throat drains, realize there's hardly any streams in these areas because everything drains down. And when it gets into karst areas, you basically have underwater streams, which it dramatically increases when you do have a release or a discharge of contaminant, contaminant spread, contaminant mobility, which dramatically drives up cost of cleanup and affects many, many more people very, very quickly. And I voted no for a lot of other reasons, but there's not enough time left, so thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All members voted. Clerk will take the roll. Means 69 members voting aye, 26 members voting nay. Senate Bill 89, as amended by House Committee Substitute 1, is passed. Gentleman from Webster.
Move the clincher.
Without objection, clincher is applied. Gentleman from McCracken.
Mr. Speaker, I move you, sir, that House Bill 491 be